The atmosphere inside the interrogation rooms at 84 Avenue Foch in Paris was carefully engineered to strip a human being of their will. By the time a British agent found themselves handcuffed to a heavy wooden chair in that building, the headquarters of the Spycraft in France, they had likely already endured a dismantling of their physical and psychological defenses. The German security apparatus, particularly the SD and the Gestapo, operated with a terrifying thoroughness that treated counterespionage not just as a duty, but as an industrial process. A captured agent was stripped naked, their clothing examined seam by seam, their shoes taken apart, their body cavities inspected. The logic was absolute. A prisoner who possesses nothing possesses no hope. They confiscated the obvious weapons immediately, the Welrod suppressed pistols, the Sten guns, the Mills bombs. Then they found the covert items, the cyanide pills hidden in glasses frames, the compasses concealed in buttons, the codes printed on silk handkerchiefs. To the German mind, once a prisoner was processed, they were neutralized. They were merely biological archives of information waiting to be opened through violence or sleep deprivation. Yet, in 1943, there existed a terrifying anomaly in this system of total control, a microscopic oversight in the German dragnet that measured less than 3 inches long and weighed less than a swallow of water. It was the lapel knife, the thumb dagger, a sliver of British steel that represented the Special Operations Executive's refusal to accept that any situation was truly hopeless. To understand the existence of such a weapon, one must first understand the unique desperation that birthed the Special Operations Executive. When Winston Churchill ordered the creation of the SOE in July 1940, with the mandate to set Europe ablaze, Britain was facing an existential abyss. The armies of the Third Reich dominated the continent. Conventional warfare had failed. The British response was to wage a war of shadows, sending lone men and women into the heart of occupied territory to sabotage, subvert, and organize resistance. These agents were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were saboteurs operating without the protection of the Geneva Convention. If captured, they faced torture and execution. The equipment provided to them reflected this grim reality. The labs at Station X and Station the 12th produced marvels of clandestine engineering, explosive rats, fake logs, radios that fit in suitcases. But the planners in Baker Street knew that all these gadgets were offensive tools. They helped an agent fight the war, but they could not help an agent who had already lost. The moment of capture was the critical failure point. Once the pistol was kicked away and the handcuffs clicked shut, the agent entered a realm where standard military logic ceased to apply. The SOE needed a weapon that existed outside that logic, a weapon designed for the specific, claustrophobic nightmare of the interrogation room. The solution came from two men whose experience lay far outside the polite traditions of the British military establishment. William Ewart Fairbairn and Eric Anthony Sykes were not theorists. They were practitioners of violence who had forged their skills in the chaotic, blood-soaked streets of 1920s Shanghai. As officers in the Shanghai Municipal Police, they had operated in what was arguably the most dangerous policing environment in the world, dealing with triad gangsters, armed robbers, and kidnappers on a daily basis. In Shanghai, a hesitation of half a second meant death. Fairbairn, whose body was a map of scar tissue from dozens of knife fights and shootouts, had developed a system of combat that was brutally efficient. He synthesized jiu-jitsu, Chinese boxing, and street wrestling into a style known as gutter fighting. There was no chivalry in it, only physics and anatomy applied with maximum aggression. When war broke out, the British military summoned these two men to the quiet Hertfordshire countryside, to a commandeered estate known as Station 12, Aston House. Here, amidst the manicured lawns and manor houses, they established a school of murder. While Fairbairn and Sykes are best remembered for the famous F's fighting knife, the elegant, 7-inch stiletto carried by commandos, they knew that such a weapon was a liability for a spy. A 7-inch dagger is a bulky object. It requires a sheath, a belt, or a boot. It prints against clothing. It clatters when dropped. In a strip search, it is as obvious as a rifle. The challenge was to create a killing tool that could vanish. They needed to shrink the lethality of the commando dagger into a form factor that defied detection. The result of their experiments at Aston House was the lapel knife. It was an exercise in minimalism. The weapon consisted of a single piece of steel, usually between 3 and 4 inches in total length. There was no handle, no guard, no pommel, nothing that would add bulk. The grip was merely a flat tang, roughly the width of a human thumb, often textured to prevent slipping. The blade itself was short, rarely exceeding 2.5 inches, appearing more like an oversized needle or a shard of industrial scrap than a weapon of war. But the design was deliberate. It was not meant to slash or parry. It was designed for a single, overwhelming puncture wound. The genius of the lapel knife lay not in the steel, but in the leather. The sheath was a masterpiece of covert engineering, often crafted by a local village cobbler named Arthur Akers, who worked in the shadow of the secret base. The sheath was flat, made of thin, high-quality leather, or sometimes flexible metal, and perforated with a series of small holes along the edges. These holes allowed the sheath to be sewn directly into the fabric of an agent's clothing. It could be stitched behind the lapel of a heavy trench coat, inside the stiff collar of a jacket, along the thick seam of a trouser leg, or even into the waistband. Once installed, the knife ceased to be an object carried by the agent and became a structural component of their wardrobe. A German soldier patting down a suspect would feel only the stiffness of a coat collar or the thickness of a seam, even if the agent were stripped. A cursory inspection of the pile of clothing on the floor would reveal nothing metallic or weapon-like. The matte black finish applied to the steel ensured that even if a glimmer of light hit the blade, it wouldn't reflect. It was a shadow carried within a shadow. However, possessing the weapon was only half the equation. The agent had to be willing to use it. This required a psychological conditioning that was entirely new to Western military training. At the special training schools, STS in the remote Scottish Highlands at Uros, and later at the finishing school at Balliol in Hampshire, agents were inducted into the dark arts of close-quarters assassination. The training was visceral. Instructors, often vetted by Fairborn himself, taught that in a life-or-death struggle, the rules of civilized society were a suicide pact. They introduced the students to the timetable of death. This was a clinical, terrifying diagram that mapped the human body not by organs, but by vulnerabilities. It showed the major arteries, the carotid, the subclavian, the femoral, the brachialand, listed the seconds required for an enemy to lose consciousness if these vessels were the carotid artery in the neck, 5 seconds to unconsciousness, 12 to death, the subclavian artery beneath the collarbone, 2 seconds to unconsciousness. The numbers were stark, absolute, and, as modern medicine has revealed, largely optimistic. Rex Applegate, an American disciple of Fairborn, would later admit that the timetable was propaganda as much as it was biology, but the accuracy of the seconds mattered less than the confidence it instilled. A young radio operator or courier needed to believe that they possessed the power of a god, though ability to turn a terrifying giant of an SS guard into a corpse in the span of a single breath. The physical technique for using the lapel knife was drilled until it was less a conscious decision and more a reflex. The grip was peculiar to the weapon. A small lanyard cord, often silk or gut, was attached to the handle. The agent would slip their index finger through this loop and pinch the flat metal temps between their thumb and the side of their curled index finger. This thumb grip allowed for a tremendous amount of force to be driven into a thrust, without the hand sliding forward onto the blade. It also meant that if the agent opened their hand, the knife would not fall. It would dangle from the finger, ready to be regrasped instantly. The training scenarios were grimly specific. Agents were taught to act submissive, to cower, to feign the resignation of the defeated. In the interrogation room, while the guard or officer was distracted or leaning in to intimidate, the agent would make a casual, non-threatening movement, reaching to adjust a collar, scratching a neck, smoothing a lapel. In that split second, the stitching would be ripped, or the blade slid from its hidden pocket. The strike had to be explosive. There was no sparring, no fencing, just a singular drive toward the soft targets of the throat or the subclavian notch. This weapon represented the ultimate asymmetry of the intelligence war. The Germans had the buildings, the guards, the dogs, and the guns. The British agent had a 2-inch piece of scrap metal and the element of surprise. It was a weapon of chaos. The doctrine did not suggest that a lapel knife would allow an agent to fight their way out of a Gestapo headquarters, like an action hero. The reality was far more pragmatic and brutal. The knife was a key to create a momentary lapse in control. A guard clutching a bleeding throat cannot aim his Luger. An interrogator recoiling from a sudden attack creates a gap in the perimeter. In that gap lay the only percentage of survival. It gave the agent seconds to grab the guard's gun, seconds to dive through a window, seconds to swallow a poison pill if escape proved impossible. It was a tool designed to change the narrative of the interrogation from a slow, inevitable dismantling into a sudden, violent crisis. There were variations on the theme, as the engineers at Estonhouse and the manufacturers at H.G. Long in Sheffield iterated on the concept. The sleeve dagger was a longer, triangular spike designed to be strapped to the forearm, sliding down into the hand. The insole dagger was perhaps the most ingenious and difficult to use. A curved blade hidden inside the leather shoe, accessible only if the agent could remove their footwear and pull a hidden cord. But the lapel knife remained the standard, the most ubiquitous of the hidden blades. It was adopted enthusiastically by the American OSS, the precursor to the CIA, who saw the ruthless pragmatism of the British design and copied it wholesale. Thousands were manufactured, carried into France, Norway, Holland, and Belgium by men and women who parachuted into the dark, knowing the odds were stacked against them. The threading that held the knives in place was chosen with obsessive care. The tailors at the thatched barn Station 15 knew that German manufacturing differed from British. A knife sewn in with the wrong thread or the wrong stitch pattern would be a beacon to a trained eye. Everything had to be perfect. The deception had to be absolute. Despite the thousands of knives produced and the intense training devoted to their use, history remains frustratingly silent on their actual deployment. The archives of the sewn mania, which were burned in a massive bonfire at the end of the war to protect the identities of operatives, yield no specific after-action reports of a lapel knife ending a German interrogation. There is no verified account of a British agent drawing the thumb, dagger and slashing their way to freedom from Avenue Foch. This silence has led some historians to view the weapon as a psychological crutch rather than a practical tool, a talisman given to doomed agents to make them feel less naked, less vulnerable. However, the absence of evidence in the clandestine world is rarely evidence of absence. The very nature of the weapon meant that if it was used successfully, the agent escaped to fight another day, perhaps without ever filing a formal report on the specific mechanics of the brawl. If it was used unsuccessfully, the agent was dead, and the German record keepers were hardly likely to document their own vulnerability to a prisoner they had supposedly secured. We do know that agents fought back with whatever was at hand. The story of Frank Pickersgill is a testament to this spirit. A Canadian giant of a man, Pickersgill was captured and tortured at Avenue Foch. He didn't use a lapel knife. He used a broken wine bottle to slash the throat of an SS guard and attack another before throwing himself out of a second-story window. He was recaptured, broken, and eventually executed at Buchenwald. But his defiance proved that the opportunity for resistance existed even in the heart of the beast. Similarly, Michael Trotobus, the legendary SO agent in northern France, died gun in hand, taking SD officers with him during the raid on his safe house. These men possessed the spirit that the lapel knife embodied. They refused to submit. Whether a thumb dagger specifically drew blood in these encounters is lost to the fog of war, but the mindset required to use one was undeniably present. The comparison with German intelligence agencies is telling. The Abwehr and the SD were sophisticated organizations, but there is no record of them developing a similar systematic program of sewn and concealment weapons for their own spies. The German approach to espionage was different, rooted more in traditional military hierarchy and signal intelligence. The idea of sewing a shiv into the collar of a gentleman's jacket was a uniquely British invention. Born of a specific underdog mentality, it reflected a nation that had been pushed to the brink of invasion, forcing it to abandon the concept of fighting fair in favor of simply fighting to survive. The lapel knife was the physical manifestation of ungentlemanly warfare. It was a dirty weapon for a dirty war, acknowledging that when democracy is at stake, the rules of engagement are a luxury one cannot afford. The legacy of the lapel knife survives today. Though genuine examples are incredibly rare, most were lost in the field, buried in French soil, or confiscated and destroyed. The ones that remain in museums like the Imperial War Museum in London are often overlooked by visitors. Drawn to the larger guns or the Enigma machines, they sit in glass cases, small, unassuming strips of black metal that look more like tools than weapons. Yet, to hold one away a faithful reproduction is to understand the terrifying intimacy of the war the SOE fought. It brings home the reality of an agent sitting alone in a cell, waiting for the heavy footsteps in the corridor. It represents the final line of defense. When the radio is gone, when the network is blown, when the pistol is taken, and when the cyanide pill is lost, the agent is still not unarmed. In the end, the efficacy of the lapel knife cannot be measured solely by a body count or a list of confirmed kills. Its true value lay in the mindset it fostered. It was a tangible promise from the SO to its agents. We are sending you into hell, but we are not sending you defenseless. It reinforced the training that said an agent was never a victim, always a combatant. Even bound, even searched, even surrounded, the capacity for violence remained. That tiny strip of steel, hidden in the fold of a coat, was a secret that belonged to the agent alone. A final reservoir of agency, in a world designed to strip them of it. It was the material proof that while the enemy might capture the body, they had not yet disarmed the mind. The lapel knife was, in its simplest form, crystallized hope, sharp, cold, and waiting for the split second to strike.